Good morning, everyone, or good evening, as the case may be. My name is Kathy Chan, and as Paul Bramadat is on sabbatical this year, I am the acting director of the Center for Studies in Religion and Society for 2022-2023. I am currently in the same country, I think, as tonight's speaker. But I'd like to welcome you nonetheless to the University of Victoria, which is hosting this event, and to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and WSÁNEĆ peoples, whose historical relationship with the land continues to this day. Today's talk, which we're really excited for, is being co-hosted by the CSRS, as we call it, and UVic's Religion, Culture, and Society program. If you are new to these communities and these events, I encourage you to visit our website. We've got a lot of interesting things lined up for this year. But for now, I will just welcome you all here tonight, and I will turn you over to Dr. Andrew Wender, the director of the Religion, Culture, and Society program, who's going to introduce tonight's speaker. Andrew.
Thank you so much, Kathy, and thank you so much for the opportunity to collaborate between the CSRS and the Religion, Culture, and Society program on this event, about which we are indeed very, very excited today. So it's my privilege to introduce Professor John McGuckin, who will be speaking on the topic Orthodoxy in Kiev and Moscow, History of an Ecclesial Union or Subjugation. Question mark at the end, decidedly so. Professor McGuckin is the Nielsen Emeritus Professor of Byzantine Christianity at Columbia University and Union Theological Seminary, and currently serves on the Faculty of Theology in the University of Oxford, from the locale where he's speaking now at his home in Oxford. And before inviting Professor McGuckin to give his talk, I just wanted to say for a moment how it was that we came to have the privilege of reaching out to Professor McGuckin and hearing that he'd be very willing to give this talk in September. So colleagues on the Religion, Culture, and Society Program Committee were discussing back in March, just after the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine war, how anticipating that unfortunately the war might very well still remain salient, very much at the forefront of people's minds in the fall, that it would really be important to bring in a speaker with great expertise in thinking about orthodoxy in relation to the conflict. And indeed, it is, of course, all too much tragically the case that the war is as salient as ever in the world. And we reached out to Professor McGuckin after having read his book, a superb, just kind of hold it up to my camera, a superb recent history of the Eastern Orthodox Church, A New History, from Yale University Press, 2020, a very lucid and extraordinarily illuminating book for historical and contemporary background on the Orthodox Church. So indeed, Professor McGuckin is exceptionally well positioned to help us better understand the overlapping context about which he's here to speak right now. So thank you so much for the opportunity, and Professor McGuckin, I'll give it over to you.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you, Kathy. It is a privilege for me to be invited to speak before you all this morning, though actually it's evening time in England. Thank you for this kind invitation. My topic today is to reflect on the role of Eastern Orthodox ideas and culture in affairs beginning with the recent incursions into Ukrainian sovereignty after 2014 and culminating in the Russian invasion of Ukraine beginning in February 22, still continuing as we meet today in September. For it is clear enough, I think, that aspects of religious philosophy and culture are closely involved here, but in a complicated way. But I'm not going to consider today the political aspects, which are doubtless primary in this conflict. Issues such as the desire of Russia for a deep water all-year harbor, such as offered by Crimea, or the unfulfilled and perhaps unfulfillable promises of NATO states to consider Ukrainian membership, which have raised the potential of having oppositional nuclear capacity on the borders of mainland Russia. Nor will I consider even the centuries of imperial presumption that have characterized Russian attitudes to the Ukraine from the time of Catherine the Great to the Orange Revolution that ousted Viktor Yanukovych. Instead, my focus today will be on the extent that Russian Orthodox cultural and religious ideas play in this relation between the churches of Kiev and Moscow. The religious cultural underpinnings can be seen active politically, both from the Ukrainian and the Russian sides. Was it not the case, for example, that Petro Poroshenko, the fifth Ukrainian president, ran his campaign around three slogans: Armia, Muva, Vira, that is, the centrality for him of the army, the language, and the faith. This religious cultural underpinning from the Russian side is extensive also, deep-rooted, certainly in Vladimir Putin and the current Orthodox Patriarch Kirill of Moscow, and has been elaborated many times publicly from the Slavophile movement of the 19th century through to current neo-nationalist ideologues such as Alexander Dugin. One shorthand for that is the theory of Ruski Mir, the greater Russian world, that is bonded together by ties of history, culture, and familiar language, which those Orthodox Christians who support it, and they are not everyone, claim to be rooted in the Byzantine traditions of our church's governance, traditions which are alleged to be of equal validity to, but misunderstood by, the West, with its much more fragmented and secularized views on the exercise of state power. I will come back to that issue in due course to see to what extent the claim Ruski Mir represents a valid extension of Byzantine church traditions. So my talk will have three parts. Part one will open with some general observations about the present influence of religious aspects of the conflict. Part two will be a brief look at the history of how religion became so closely woven into the development of Ukraine and Russia, and ending with some notes on how formative elements of the particular Slavic tropes of Orthodoxy, somewhat bent out of shape in modern times, I would say, might have added to present difficulties. And part three will be some summing up remarks about how things stand now and for the foreseeable future. So part one. From the outset, we can see clearly that one of the elements involved in this crisis is the determination of many Orthodox Christians in Ukraine to distance themselves from the spiritual governance of the Russian Orthodox Patriarch in Moscow. Now, this began a long time ago, if we take into consideration the complex situation of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, the 17th century, in fact. But it is also true in relation purely to the Orthodox churches in Ukraine, which are subject to Moscow. And that began in the early 20th century and gained new momentum after Ukrainian independence from the Soviets. The contemporary flight from what is known as the ecclesial jurisdiction of Moscow was encouraged greatly by President Poroshenko and has eventually been formalized most recently by the senior Orthodox Patriarch Bartholomeus of Constantinople, whose awarding of the status of autocephaly, which means independence basically, to the three forms of dissentient Ukrainian Orthodox Church was clearly a rebuke to the Moscow Patriarchate for being so subservient to Russian state ideology. It was a rebuke that has resulted in the Moscow Synod breaking communion with Constantinople, one of the most serious ruptures in Orthodoxy for many decades. The claim by many Russian Orthodox and most of Patriarch Kirill's Synod of Bishops that they have a continuing right to dominance over all the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which is one strong indication of the pervasiveness of the theory of the Ruski Mir, can also be seen to be widely contested among most other Orthodox churches, not least from the rapid condemnation of the Russian invasion by so many other Orthodox hierarchs. This protest was led by the Patriarch of Constantinople, followed by a widespread call among world Orthodox leaders for the violence between fellow Orthodox nations to be brought to a speedy end. There were some notable silences, as for example, the large Serbian and very small Chinese Orthodox churches, both of whom are closely allied with Russian cultural and religious goals. So, is there a fight for Orthodox values going on here, as Patriarch Kirill and other Russian advocates of the invasion claim? He and his spokesman have frequently blamed the conflict on, I quote, so-called malicious elements. His code word, I think, for Greek Catholics on the one hand, whom the Synod blames for fomenting the desire to hold the Moscow Patriarchate to account and offensively designating them as uniate, a charge that in current political usage is covered by the code words political chauvinism and ecclesiastical schism. This hostile vocabulary has also now been passed on to the breakaway Orthodox churches, resulting in the specious charge that the Russian army is a force meant to liberate Ukraine from fascism. But these so-called malicious elements that Patriarch Kirill speaks about are also clearly meant to encompass the Western powers. And it is Moscow's view that their agent has been the Patriarch of Constantinople, affording independent liberty to the Ukrainian Orthodox as an attempt, allegedly, to politically destabilize Russian politics. The Constantinopolitan Patriarchate, however, has had a long history of protective supervision of the diaspora Slavic churches, which have sought to escape the control of the Soviet governments of the past. And indeed, historically, that Patriarchate took direct charge of the Church of Kiev in the 15th and again in the early 17th centuries, before shortly afterwards transferring the responsibility by proxy to Moscow. It is the case then that there are values at play here, that the secular West never understood and cannot appreciate? Or is it rather a question of some deep-seated attitudes at play that needs to be brought out into the light of day to see if their religious garb is genuine or masquerade? One of the terms we have accepted into common parlance these days in the aftermath of the Russian invasion, for that's what it was, and no amount of fake news or what George Orwell called doublespeak in his famous study of Soviet propaganda in the novel 1984, and no amount of doublespeak can mask that fact that it is an invasion. But one of the new terms we've found is the word irredentism. I have to confess that I had never heard of it before spring 2022, but it comes out of 19th century Italian politics and signifies the policy of advocating and struggling for the return to Italy of all Italian-speaking districts that were presently subject to other countries' governments. When I checked on the dictionary article, then I got the picture vis-a-vis Ukraine. But what has happened in the recent invasion of Ukraine is actually much more than this. Irredentism might explain the decision to send in the little green men to Eastern Ukrainian Russian-speaking provinces. Those were the Russian troops pretending that they weren't there. Or even the decisions to hold show plebiscites to indicate how the local populations of the Crimea and the Donbass allegedly wanted to be liberated and more deeply united with Mother Russia. But the wider set of political and military ideas that were in play after February 22 showed clearly enough that more than irredentism was at work here. Rather, the attempt to assert a new era of Russian imperial expansion Even an attempt, however desperate that now looks, since Ukraine demonstrated that it was certainly not going to go the way of Georgia, for Moscow to raise itself once more as the undisputed center of the Ruski Mir. It is this notion of the Ruski Mir, that concept of the greater Russian world of cultural and political confederation, that I would like to reflect on here. For it is in this point, I believe, that the confluence of church and state thinking in Russia overlap to some extent, or at least that it might explain for us why some Russian Orthodox clergy are so closely allied with Vladimir Putin, why some see the Ukrainian invasion as a desirable means towards the goal of reasserting the Ruski Mir, and why, for example, no less a figure than Patriarch Kirill of Moscow actually called that February invasion. And I want to pause for a moment here to unpack that little word, invasion, which the Patriarch and President are too delicate to pronounce, to remind ourselves that in this case it means the bombing of hospitals and civilian targets, the mutilation of men, women, and children, the destruction of villages, churches, and farms, the scattering of thousands into the wretchedness of exile, as well as widespread rape, torture, and illegal assassination. Why the Orthodox Patriarch of Moscow called that action, quote, a fight for religious values. If one was to put those sentiments into an acid wash so as to reveal them a little more clearly beyond the surface fudge, I suspect it would be the resonant chime of President Putin, who often has complained that the loss of the Soviet Empire is the very worst thing that has happened to Russia since the era of the Tsars, and something he wishes to reverse. And from the viewpoint of Patriarch Kirill, the latter seems to want, first of all, the return to his jurisdiction of all the very large numbers of Ukrainian Orthodox parishes that have voted with their feet and turned their back on him, seeking instead the protection and relative non-interference of the Constantinopolitan Patriarch. Did he, perhaps, dream wistfully of the time under the Soviets when so many other ancient and independent Orthodox churches were forcibly subjected to the Moscow Patriarchate's dominion as an arm of state control? The Moscow Patriarchate, under the Soviets, scandalously assented to and cooperated in the obliteration of ancient Orthodox church structures, such as the Patriarchates of Bulgaria and Georgia, as well as the widespread suppression of religious freedoms, even those of itself. This is why, for most of the other world Orthodox, this latter vision of Moscow control is a nightmare of the subjugation of the church that was even worse than the 5 centuries it was imprisoned under Ottoman regulation. The Soviet care of the Eastern Orthodox churches under the nominal supervision of the Moscow Patriarchate was in actuality one of the most extensive and destructive persecutions Christianity has ever known. And world Orthodoxy today is still trying to recover from the trauma of it. No one outside the Kremlin could ever imagine that world Orthodoxy would accept this solution once more. For the late Russian Empire, Ruski Mir was based on 3 principles: Orthodoxy, Russian language, and shared culture. Patriarch Kirill cited its re-establishment as a great hope in one of his first ever speeches as the new patriarch in May 2009, 2 years after Vladimir Putin himself had established the state-funded neo-nationalist Ruski Mir Foundation, which is worth looking up. 3 months after the February invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the Patriarch again echoed Vladimir Putin, whom in 2008 he had called, quote, a miracle of God, by saying that Lenin's, quote, tragic dismemberment of Russia into different countries was a serious mistake that has repercussions even today, end quote. The patriarch seems to regard Ruski Mir as a golden dream, comparable, I think, to the romantic fantasy of the world of Holy Rus that sees the 19th century idealists from Leskov to Gogol and later artists such as Nestorov. Several Orthodox theologians, led in the main from the Greek side, especially the centers at Volos and Fordham, but garnering 500 signatories of intellectuals, have recently issued a denunciation of the Ruski Mir as a heretical idea, fundamentalist and totalitarian in character. I think the statement is a good beginning, but is somewhat weakened by the pleonastic nature of the objections that they raise and their unexamined history of one of its key platforms, namely Philotism. I can explain that if anyone is interested later. So we come to part two. Let me fall back a little here and begin in this second part to sketch out how Orthodoxy came to the Slavic world and fashioned a deep relation between Kiev and Moscow that was eventually formalized in ecclesial structures. Then I will address how the forms of Russian Orthodoxy that both shared developed in such ways that a common worldview prevalent in ancient Orthodox thinking was reshaped, nuanced in Slavic forms that led to what may be seen as tendencies that perhaps could lead to future troubles, and did. And finally, how such religious ideas, if badly stressed and nuanced, can lead to the strange situation of a patriarch of the world's largest individual Orthodox church, actually choosing to stand alongside Vladimir Putin's aggressive and heartless war and ridiculously describe it as, quote, a fight for religious values. Perhaps he only meant this symbolically, not militarily, as he is also on record as saying, quote, Russia has never attacked anyone, end quote. So first, on my part, an equally ridiculous short history of Kiev and Moscow. The foundational story of the origins of the state is found in the 11th to 12th century Tale of Bygone Years, also known as the Russian Primary Chronicle. We are told that the Slavic tribes in the major settlements of ancient Rus, which is Novgorod, Belozero, and Izborsk, refused to pay tribute to their Varangian, that is, Scandinavian Viking, overlords. And then the whole region descended into violent chaos. The suffering was such, the narrator tells us, that they finally petitioned the Varangians to come and be masters over them. The Varangian Prince Rurik was at first unwilling to come, the text tells us, quote, because he was fearful of their wild appearance and temper. But eventually the Varangian leaders settled and did establish what is now generally called the culture of the Rus. The chronicle says, quote, the name of Rus came from the Varangians, and nowadays the people of Novgorod belong to that tribe of Varangians, though initially they were Slavs. Rurik's successors, Askold and Oleg, founded a Varangian state around Kiev as its capital, which brought organization to neighboring Slav and Finnish tribes and was ultimately the birth of the nation and was fixed in cultural memory as such. So Kiev is immensely important as the symbolic birth of the people of Rus. It is actually the mother church of the Russians. This Varangian foundation of the state became a source of enduring speculation about the so-called Russian soul. And in the 19th century, it was a key issue between the Slavophiles and the pro-Westerners. The Slavophile movement stressed how the Slavic people had wisely recognized the need for governance and were the originators of their own progress and development, not subservient to or conquered by any other, but taking cultural elements from the Vikings and the Byzantines, and refashioning everything according to their own Slavic genius. The pro-Western movement, on the other hand, in Russia, stressed how, according to the story, light and order had to come from outside, and how the West and Western values were desperately needed to accelerate the crude Slavic spirit towards progress and development. In some ways, that old trope still endures, and today represents a split in contemporary Russian society between the old and the young. Another cardinal moment in the history of the nation was the invitation by Prince Vladimir of Kiev to Byzantine missionaries from Constantinople after his baptism in 988. Excuse me. Vladimir forced his people then to throw their gods into the Dnieper River and accept baptism. The later Byzantine influence was profound in the court and the church, especially sustained by monastics, but did not extend greatly to village level except through the literate elite. And so the many pre-Christian Slavic cults endured for a long time. Mongol invasions of the 13th century, however, inaugurated the destruction of Kiev and the dismantling of its political and ecclesial importance. It would enter a long period of decline and political domination by Catholic Poland, and not regain free Orthodox ecclesial status again until after 1620, and the time Peter Mohyla, a Romanian nobleman, was elected Metropolitan of Kiev in 1632. In the meantime, the rulers of Moscow grew in significance and eventually adopted the Byzantine title of Tsars, or Caesars. By the end of the Tatar era in 1480, the political and ecclesial center of Russia had certainly moved to Moscow. The general adoption of orthodoxy there became a factor that strengthened, right from the beginnings, a grave distrust of the West, especially after this third foundational memory of Russian national identity occurred, which was something consequent on the collapse of Byzantium before the Ottoman Islamic power in 1453. And this rolls out as follows. 4 years before the fall of Constantinople to Islam, the Byzantine emperor, hoping to gain Catholic military support, had agreed to a union of the Catholic and Orthodox churches at the Council of Florence. The Moscow Metropolitan Archbishop Isidore assented to the union on behalf of Russia, but he was castigated on his return, and the Russian Orthodox Church declared that Constantinople itself had lapsed into heresy by accepting papal supremacy and conforming to the decadent standards of the West. The doctrine of Moskva Tretyi Rim, or Moscow as the Third Rome, developed after this time. In short, it meant that as Rome, Italian Rome, was once the undisputed head of Christendom, but had lost that role because of its departures from strict tradition, Constantinople, also known as the New Rome, took its place as head of Christendom, but now, because of its infidelity, its ecumenicity, that role of the leader of Christendom had passed to Moscow. Moscow, the theory said, is now the Third Rome. This was a legend begun by the writer Philotheos of Pskov in 1510, and he went on with a very strongly underlined final sentence, there will be no fourth. This idea of Moscow, the third and last Rome, became an important plank in the Patriarchate of Moscow's argument that it had assumed a certain supremacy in the Orthodox Church. It was, of course, after the fall of Constantinople, the undoubted leader of Orthodoxy in terms of adherence and power. In this day, the Moscow Patriarchate has millions of faithful members, 60 million out of a world total of 260 million Orthodox. Constantinople in Turkey is numbered in the low hundreds. Even its richer adherents in the USA represent less than 0.5% of that nation's Christians. After the 15th century, Russia was the one great protector left of the Orthodox faithful in the East, while the Patriarch of Constantinople was forced by the Ottoman sultans to adopt the role of ethnarch of all Christians in the Sultanate and to collect the taxes imposed on them through his fanariot agents, a role that led to much resentment against him among the Orthodox faithful. Even so, though the balance had shifted, the Tsar of Moscow sought to consolidate the importance of his church by petitioning, and some say buying, patriarchal status. And this was granted by Patriarch Jeremias of Constantinople in 1589, who was then in Russia seeking alms, that is, money alms. But when the latter returned home with the funds, Jeremias made it clear that this new patriarchate would only rank 5th after all the other senior ones, and particularly that it must remain subordinate to his own jurisdiction. And that relative ranking is today still a tension that inflects world orthodoxy, as Moscow sees itself under Putin as once more able to offer the whole world Orthodox leadership and protections. Can you remember part of the justification for Russia entering the Syrian civil war to protect Christian minorities? Over and against this is Constantinople's claim to retain the leadership of world orthodoxy as established by church laws of the 4th century, despite its much shrunken political stature. It was this tension between real world size and symbolic size that led to the Moscow Synod's decision of 15th of October 2018 to cut the ties of communion, basically excommunicate, the Patriarchate of Constantinople and its faithful because of the latter's grant of autocephaly, that is, independence, to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine in defiance of Moscow's wishes. Now, I would like to add one last element of historical symbols that we need to consider alongside these earlier three. That is, Kiev as the mother church of the Rus, the Muscovite Tsars as the center of political dominion after Kiev's occlusion by the Tatars and the Poles, and the subsequent theory of Moscow as the Third Rome. And this fourth is the concept of Byzantine Symphonia, which underlies the modern Russian Orthodox claim that its understanding of power and organization, whether that of the church or the state, is fundamentally different to that of the West's, that it alone has solid order and discipline at its core, whereas the West is decadent and individualistically disorganized. It's a Byzantine idea. Symphonia is the Greek word for musical harmony, things acting in symphony, like two notes that sound together and make for one pleasing sound out of two separate things. The idea was applied to the idealized relation of church and state and elaborated from the time of Justinian the Great in the 6th century Byzantine Empire. Now, since the laws of Russia owed a lot to the reordering imposed on them, according to Byzantine formularies, the Justinianic novellae, which means new laws reflecting Christian values that were imported into the Roman law. These new laws were very formative there in a way they have not been on Western countries where Saxon folklore retained greater precedence. In the prelude to Justinian's Code, the idea is underscored that God took the kingdom on earth away from the Jews and gave it to the Christians. Just as the Jews had one righteous king over all and responsible for good political as well as religious order, for example, David, so too the Christians had to have one kingdom of God on earth, one king and one church. The Pope's complete disregard of this theory by his coronation of Charlemagne as alternative Holy Roman Emperor on Christmas Day 800, struck the Byzantines as the first sign of major heretical difference in terms of what God's kingdom on earth was meant to be. It is the real beginning of the separation of the Orthodox and Catholic churches. The Western Church, of course, after Augustine in the 5th century, had settled deeply on a view of two cities. It runs through Catholic and Protestant thought top to bottom. The earthly city driven by self-interest and greed, and the city of God, which was the pure eschatological heaven, not to be identified with anything on the earth, not even the church. The Byzantines saw this emphatic duality as a rejection of the close harmony, the symphonia, that ought to be operative between earthly life and divine grace, indivisibly present here and now. To put this simply, the Byzantine theory of symphonia shies away from the stricter separation that Western political theory likes to invoke between the sacred and the secular. Politically, the Western diversity of governance we now see comes from the idea of the two cities. Byzantine ideas of the world order saw the single ruler who upheld the Orthodox faith, God's chosen emperor or czar, as the defender of the borders of Christendom against all faithless attackers, either from the east or the west. You can see where this idea is going to go, can't you? But what the original text in Justinian stressed, however, and what the Byzantine carefully sustained in practical politics, is that the ruler, the king, the Vasilevs, was not so much elevated by birthright, but by divine choice. He also drew his right to rule as autocrat, autokrator, not from the will of the people, but from his appointment by God, witnessed and supported by the church. That title, autocrat, sounds chilling to us now, but originally just meant monarch. Two things that were not so often quoted, have not been so often quoted by the later adherents of this doctrine of symphonia, were first of all, A, the autocrat lost his right to rule if he did not sustain evangelical standards of morality. And secondly, that although the Byzantines afforded him the status and right as absolute ruler, a quick glance at the regnant years of various Byzantine emperors will show anybody that in the real world politics, they had massive limitations to their dominion and frequently enjoyed very short reigns indeed. Where there was no suffrage, revolution has always served instead. But symphonia is a religio-political doctrine that has certainly underpinned the Russian attitude to the emperor as having a divine right to rule. And it certainly ran on in a corrupted and fearful form, even into the claims of the Soviet leaders in totalitarian times for absolute obedience. Remove the caveats that such a dominion falls if the values it represents are not according to the spirit of the gospel. And we can see here how such a view can decay into the worst forms of absolutist governance. And if you have ever wondered why Ivan the Terrible is given such a good press in Russian history, I think you have some clues here. There was a tendency towards understanding authority in such a radical and totalist sense in the Slavic Orthodox Church traditions, however, because monasticism there, unlike its many crazy iterations in the Byzantine world, tended to be very heavily regulated. In short, Russian monasticism was militarized in the sense of the fundamental obedience it required from the monk. Such a radical expectation of complete obedience ran on through all levels of Slavic church life, even up to the bishop. And since all bishops had to be monks before they were eligible for election, we witnessed a profound trend among Slavic church leaders to be conformist, and anxious to avoid independent judgment or action. And that was put to very good use by the Russian emperors, who policed their ecclesiastical leadership very closely, exercising profound scrutiny over the selection of all of them. It was a tendency only reinforced when the NKVD and its successors up to the KGB co-opted each and every Russian Orthodox hierarch, giving them colonel's rank, code names, and a long list of expectations of how they should do their duty by the state. This takes me to part 3, or simply put, some current observations. It is this sad state of affairs that has led us today to witness a Russian synod of just over 200 bishops that apparently has no dissenting power from that of its patriarchal leader, who can scandalously describe the Russian invasion of Ukraine as, quote, a fight for religious values. One of the patriarchate's senior hierarchs, the representative for foreign engagement with other churches and countries, who had expressed some worry about the morality of the Ukrainian invasion, has been summarily replaced without being invited to the synodical meeting which dismissed him and sent off to a new episcopal appointment out of the country. When there is this level of suppression of voice, an organization is in deep trouble indeed. And in the case of the Russian church, it is reminiscent of the gloomy days of a KGB-controlled hierarchy, a time and condition when world orthodoxy understood that it had to disregard the statements of the leading Russian hierarchs as a mere front for state propaganda. The Patriarch of Constantinople, Bartholomeus, himself has suggested as much recently when he publicly questioned why Patriarch Kirill had not criticized the invasion, or at least called for a stop to the suffering of innocent civilians, even, he said, if that should have cost him his role in the church governance. So while Orthodox theology is indeed heavily influenced by Byzantine understandings, it is not wholly subsumed by them. The original Byzantine theory of Symphonia was a nuanced position, completely unlike the subservient relationship of church and state we witness today in Russia and have seen, even worse, in its past. Orthodoxy understands the notion of religious war from its long struggles of the past, but it has never accepted even the theory of a just war. This was an idea originally voiced by the pagan Cicero, but advanced in the Western Church by Saint Augustine. And from it, the Western Church and society sought to justify armed conflict in certain situations. The Orthodox have always taught that there is no such thing as a just war, that all war is evil, and only defensive violence can be tolerated, but never aggressive action. And even then, it teaches, even the defenders have to be penitent for being involved in bloody violence, even if it was necessary to defend the innocent or to defend their homeland. This is an attitude basic to Orthodox ethics on war. Anybody wants to chase me up, I've written a long piece on it in Dumbarton Oaks, Nonviolence and Peace Traditions. A first-year seminary student ought to know this. Why has it not been set out by the largest Orthodox synod of bishops in the world? Is it because of the difficulty of arguing that this was a war of self-defense on Russia's part? No harder, one might have thought, than arguing that this was not a war or invasion at all, simply a special operation. But perhaps this is even more frightening, insofar as it represents Russia's imperial pretensions, its self-assured belief that it owns the Ruski Mir, the greater Russian territory of shared culture, religion, and language, owns it regardless of the expressed democratic wishes of the various peoples involved. It made me think that on the same principle of, quote, the greater cultural world, perhaps England could reclaim America, Australia, even Canada, perhaps. And perhaps Turkey could have back all those peoples who currently speak Arabic. How patently ridiculous and dangerous the idea is if it ever moves out of the world of cultural romance. This so-called fight for religious values, Patriarch Kirill has mentioned, was further explained by him to be at root a resistance of the decadent moral values of the West. And he has specified this, as he often has done, in homophobic terms. But as President Putin made clear in his own television address at the beginning of this recent invasion, Ukraine, in his understanding, has no independent statehood. He called the present government a fascist one that, I quote, was infringing on believers' rights and preparing the destruction of the church linked to Moscow, end quote. So the Russian church was apparently throwing its moral weight behind a fight against gay rights and was prepared to bomb children in this cause. Such a moral stance, by anyone's standards, is no moral stance and has risked the moral credibility of the entire Orthodox world that has not already come out and denounced this fake morality as hostile to the whole deeper, authentic Eastern Orthodox ethos, one that has always insisted on deep compassion for fallible humanity, with a profound sense that ethics without freedom withers to nothing. Giving a speech in the Cathedral of Christ the Saviour in Moscow on May the 29th, 2022, Patriarch Kirill said, quote, "We fully understand how the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is suffering today," end quote. But he went on to opine that this was not the fault of any armed aggression by Russia, but rather because, as he said, quote, "some spirits of malice wished to divide the Orthodox people of Russia and Ukraine," end quote. He went on to express his confidence that they would not succeed. His earlier statement to a reporter, quote, "Russia has never attacked anyone," end quote, allied with his insistence that the so-called special operation was in the real sense a religious war, seems, to me at least, to have shattered any credibility that he had, either as a political commentator or a pastoral leader. But one thing is certain, he does not speak for world orthodoxy. It is a considerable scandal that the government of Great Britain has felt it necessary to specially single him out as worthy of sanction for his commitment to false propaganda. Even more so, that his name has been forwarded to the International Court of Justice. The organization Human Rights Without Frontiers has issued a statement which says, "To hold personally accountable and prosecute Vladimir Mikhailovich Gundyaev, known as Patriarch Kirill of Moscow and all Russia, for inspiring, inciting, justifying, aiding, and abetting war crimes under Article 8 of the Rome Statute and crimes against humanity, sub-Article 7, perpetrated and being perpetrated by the Russian armed forces in Ukraine," end of quote. Sadly, a great deal of ordinary Russian people resonate with the nonsense of the Ruski Mir taken as a political right rather than a cultural aspiration, as well as with the implication that orthodoxy, if only it could turn its face away from all things Western, could chart a path of purity that will set an example for the world to follow. A sad delusion, if ever there was one. Even so, Ukraine, the original heart of the broader and beautiful tradition of Slavic orthodoxy, has shown an indomitable spirit in its time of testing. The Metropolitan of the Moscow jurisdiction, Ukrainian Orthodox, did have the courage to criticize the events of the war at the outset. And there is no doubt that the Orthodox people of Ukraine have the sense to express their own mind and heart. Since May 2022, more than 400 extra parishes, once under the jurisdiction of Moscow, have allied with the independent Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And Moscow jurisdiction parishes in France and the Netherlands have also formally cut ties. In the western regions of Ukraine, excuse me, in the western regions of Ukraine, a spring poll organized by the Razumkov Center in Kiev showed that while 70% of Ukrainians identified as Orthodox, 34% now claimed allegiance to the autocephalous Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and in Western Ukraine, only 14% felt any remnant of devotion to the Moscow Synod. One can only expect that first number to rise and the second to decrease as the armed aggression continues. And thank you very much for your patient attention.
Professor McGuckin, heartfelt thanks for your deeply learned, nuanced, and humane set of comments. So much, much appreciated. We have just a bit under 10 minutes for Q&A, everybody. As my colleague Rachel Brown just indicated, we will invite you to raise your hand and be recognized if you would like to ask Professor McGuckin a question. And as was emphasized, please do keep it as brief as possible to get as many voices into the conversation as we can. Thank you. Who would like to be first, please? Professor McGuckin, while people are thinking of their questions, excuse me, I see one in the chat, so I'm actually going to cede space to this colleague here. And so let me just read it in the chat. Okay. So this is a question from, and my apologies, I don't feel that I can adequately pronounce the name. I'm just going to ask the question. My apologies to this colleague for not giving their name. What about the consideration that the Russian Orthodox Church, by supporting the invasion, is indeed protecting its own church from being suppressed and diminished by the government? Going down to there was a time when Patriarch Kirill was even considered as liberal within the Russian Orthodox Church. Thank you for that question.
I think that with the rise of the Putin government, the church has been given a very considerable following wind. And the reversal of fortunes after Russian Orthodoxy emerged from so many decades of suffocation, if you consider the percentage of the higher and priestly clergy and the deacons and the monks who were simply disappeared, murdered, it has not just had to rebuild its stone and ecclesial structures, it's had to rebuild its personnel. There's no question that Putin's government is using the church as a major factor in rebuilding the sense of Russian national identity. But when you look back over the larger period, the church under Peter the Great was in an enslaved condition. And however much you could say, well, it was much better than being killed. Right? Anything was better than that period. You have to pay a price for support. And many people have looked at the tobacco tax and the alcohol tax, from which the church gains a large amount of income, and have thought that this is not something that church needs to be standing on in the conditions of modern Russian social life. So it's an incredibly difficult balance to have. I mean, who would really want to be patriarch under a czar in the present conditions? But, it's easy to say, and I think that I wouldn't have said it, but the Patriarch of Constantinople said, if you're bombing indiscriminate targets in this way, it is the duty of the senior religious leader of an Orthodox country, a church that abhors all war, to have said something more substantial than we've had, and certainly not calling this a fight for religious values. This is something that has to call out something more substantial, or that the church, the Orthodox Church across the world, will be shamed. That's how I would. But there's no easy solution to these things.
Thank you so much. We see that Andrew Conradi has a hand up. Please feel welcome to go ahead and pose your question. Go ahead.
Thank you.
Yourself. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Good. I'm just wondering, as a Catholic, if Patriarch, excuse me, Bartholomew has such bad relations with Kirill, how can my Pope Francis hope to even get close to Kirill? I mean, much as I love Francis, I think he's crazy on that score. What do you think?
Well, he is on record as having phoned Patriarch Kirill and came away saying that it was a dead-end conversation. And apparently, so from what I've heard, the Pope said, "We are here to be independent voices, not altar boys of presidents." On the other hand, the Pope is head of his own Vatican state, so he's out of the reach of this. The record of the relationship between the patriarchs and the czars was never a happy one, and Peter the Great, of course, suppressed the patriarchate for many centuries. It was a happier one in Byzantine times, when you have a theory that the one thing that governs both emperor and patriarch is the spirit of gospel evangelical morality. But I'm not sure that is working in the present moment, even though the president puts on a lot of shows of lay piety whenever he can. One gets the sense in the present iteration of things that the church is being used as a massively neo-nationalist organization, and that should make us all very worried.
Thank you so much. I think we'll probably have time for one more question to be answered fulsomely. I'd like to place it from Don Wren, and the question is as follows. Obedience to ecclesial and civil authority is a doctrinal requirement in church. Can we expect widespread resistance by the Russian faithful?
Well, I think I would qualify that first one, that ecclesial and religious obedience is required to our religious and spiritual and state leaders, as the Byzantine Charter said, when they are in accord with the spirit of the gospel. Resistance is required when they are not, of course. So at the end of the day, the primacy of human conscience has to be woven in with the traditions of the church, in the sense that we're not always the wisest guides, but freedom of conscience works hand in hand with the tradition of the saints that precede us. And we have as many examples of religious dissidents from the great saints of the past. And that was going to lead up to the second part of my answer, but I've forgotten what the question was now, sorry.
I thank you so much. I want to be mindful of time. We're just at about 11:59 Victoria time. And I think, to me, your mention of the primacy of conscience in your response to Don Wren's question really underscores what's so profound in the tenor of your talk. And we are indeed most indebted to you for helping to provide so much more understanding of what's at stake religiously, culturally, and geopolitically in key respects, even as you so understandably don't focus as much on the political, and it gives us a much richer understanding than we had before. Please join me, everybody, in virtually thanking Professor McGuckin for this extraordinarily valuable talk. I want to just hand it over at the end to my colleagues from the CSRS, Rachel Brown or Kathy Chan, to just speak about this slide about the next upcoming talk. Thank you, everybody.
All right, just very quickly, let me reiterate our thanks to Professor McGuckin. That was an incredibly rich talk, so we're very grateful. Next week, we have a group of people, Sara Famen, Amélie Barras, Catherine Bullock, Aaron Hughes, Savar Kuzukwoglu, contributing authors coming to talk about their book on producing Islams in Canada. So that should also be an interesting and diverse set of observations. So we hope you can join us then.